Okay, given the exigencies of time and the fact that there was so little opportunity after the last session for speakers from the floor, I'm going to make two executive decisions. The first is I'm not going to attempt any spurious synthesis of two wonderfully disparate presentations. And the second is perhaps we just leave Luke in his seat and allow him his full span for a solo presentation in 10 minutes' time as scheduled to try and get us back onto the printed programme. Could I ask John to join me then here and go, if you don't mind, straight to the floor. That allows us 10 minutes and it will be the last chance for people from the audience to speak. So we have 10 full minutes before Luke's closing remarks, if everybody's happy with that. If Woodrow and Koyo are, for example. I see what you were talking about earlier about the lights. Maybe you could bring the lights a little bit down. They're not as bad, I suspect, as they were earlier, but if we're going to the floor directly. Okay, that's great. So, are there any contributions, questions from the floor? Just in the middle there.
I just wanted to touch on...
Could you wait for the microphone, please, just in case? Great, thanks.
John almost said it. It's about the invention of tradition in post-colonial situation. John was touching it on the invention or the reinvention of the past. With this, in the case of the Carnegie Library, where they were creating a national style with a tokenism to 12th century Romanesque buildings here. You get it in church architecture and a few public buildings. But also the post-colonial situation, the new states and the new societies again reinvent a phony past. And he of Edmund Carpenter again, where he having taken away a person's culture and their past, the new societies either create a phony past or it is given to them. He's talking about, we'd say, North American Indians. He has one wicked thing where he said, and we have the North American Indian whose costumes come from a mail order catalogue and who get their philosophy from hippies and they're dancing around doing traditional dances. He also deals with Eskimos and their art, where the art is not created for themselves, it's created for us. And the same happens with a lot of African art, where one critic once described it as airport art. It's made by Africans, but it's for a European clientele. And the other thing I want to touch on is we're talking about the mentally colonized, and the administrators of almost all of the new states have been colonized because either, if they're military dictators, they've studied in Sandhurst or some other, or in South America, they've studied in the torture school, the College of the Americas, or whatever it was, and if they've been to Western universities. But the same happens with museums and art galleries are alien institutions. And many of the people here have been curators who studied in either Britain or Amsterdam or things like that. And the museum is an alien institution, and they themselves have been contaminated by Western thinking, Western modern art, which bears very little resemblance to the real lives of ordinary people. I'll leave it at that. And
yeah.
The other thing is...
Sorry, well, you already had two things, so if you don't mind, because we're going to get, let's do that 7 minutes. So we have a question about, it's a very large question, of course, and it's been addressed many times before, but about the invention of tradition, and then perhaps the second question about the contamination of the museum. And I'll invite John and Aislinn to respond to either or both of those topics.
On the evidence of this weekend, I'd have no fear for the art museum It's shown itself to be a laboratory of all sorts of extraordinary possibilities, and also a determination to get it through. My despair would be that in terms of the school curriculum, you can forget it. In terms of teaching a history, people a history, I think ordinary people's history, history from below, whatever you want to call it, that didn't happen at all during the years of independence. We had official history, we had history from the top, we had history of the winners. It does seem to me that the museum has a possibility. I know that the Limerick Museum, which has been terribly starved of funds, as I try to point out, 8 sites in 40 years, right? That shows that is neglect on an appalling scale in terms of the city, the civic sense of itself. And it happened, I think, very specifically for one reason. It happened because at that point, from in the 1970s onwards, the city rulers, the city fathers as they used to be called, and one of its adjuncts, Shannon Heritage, they discovered heritage as a commodity that could be sold, an acceptable form of our past, but simply as a site of international entertainment and travel. So the fabrication of medieval streets and so on.
John behind postcards.
Well, yes, and I suppose that's a little bit before it, but it's all part of that process.
And Bunratty without the tubercular cough.
The curators in the Limerick Museum have been absolutely extraordinary. They have collected, and they've been great collectors all the time when they were waiting to be shifted to their next building. They've been collecting the material culture of the ordinary people. And those 2 youngsters, like their grandfathers now, their children might be able to come into a museum in the future, a museum of the future, and interrogate the past through that.
Sorry, I'm aware of the fact that we have so little time and there are hands up everywhere there, or there were a second ago. Actually, would you like to respond, or would I go straight back to the floor?
I'll make a quick response.
Sure.
I'm always very wary of the language of essentialism and purity and so on, especially when we use it in the context of colonialism and the language of contagion. I think that one needs to be very careful about how these metaphors operate. I think Catalina earlier spoke very well about, I think she mentioned Jimmy Durham, just as a projection of the authenticity of the primitive. And I have to say, I feel deeply uncomfortable with this sort of snide dismissal of, and I'm speaking about this because of the ways of seeing the attempts to, after the experience of residential schooling and stolen children in Canada and elsewhere, the attempts to restitute a sense of solidarity and worth, and also different forms of connections to one's own past. I've been more concerned about the fabrication of the imaginaries, as Mary was talking about, the British imaginary that fails to mention slave ships, that fails to mention so much of that heritage. So I'm always a little cautious about the ways in which, it's like, well, they're kind of cobbling together a fictitious imaginary. The most powerful imaginaries at the moment, if we look at some of Cameron's recent speeches about fundamental British values and so on, are these imperialist imaginaries that we're seeing, and these sort of colonial imaginaries that are premised upon notions of purity and a forgetting or a dismissal, like Mary was saying, of, let's not talk about the past. So that would be more my concern in that respect. So I'd be worried about the kinds of dismissal of the attempt to restore different forms of indigenous practice on the basis that they're kind of mail order outfits and so on.
Thanks. Another question, yeah?
Thank you very much, Niamh Nick from the University of Limerick. I just wanted to pick up on that point of the phony past or the invented tradition, and a quote that was in a couple of newspapers recently of academics as being kind of the high priests of commemoration recently, and that we have to be very careful in terms of the way in which we embody and participate in a kind of historical conservatism that doesn't do justice to the need for the expanded, political imagination. There was the mention of the impoverished political imagination. And I think that this EVA in particular, as someone who grew up as an EVA baby and has been going to all the EVAs, this feels very urgent and feels very important and feels very like it is expanding the political imagination. But one thing that I do feel is kind of uncomfortably sitting in the room in relation to this conversation, and that was in this room during the Limerick Spring Festival of Politics and Ideas, is the position of the direct provision centres in relation to all of this, and the way in which our political imagination is or is not allowing that presence to be heard and felt at the moment. And I wondered if in the light of this EVA, in the light of I suppose, in avoiding a political, impoverished political imagination, whether the panel has any questions on that, and actually particularly to do with the architectural spaces and siting of those, of the direct provision centres.
No.
I mean, 90% what you said was a fascinating statement rather than a question, but if anybody wants to respond to it, or perhaps somebody from the floor, I'm sorry if I'm trying to rush things on, but I'm trying to allow as many people to speak as possible.
They're holding centres. They're buckets. It's political expediency of very, at its lowest form. There's not much else to say.
Well, I think it's part of, it's like we finally get rid of the laundries, and then we need another shameful institution to apologise for in the next 20 years. I think this is another great shame. It's intolerable, it's absolutely intolerable what's happening. I think that Bukhasin's project, Asylum Archive, is quite extraordinary in his, if any of you don't know it, look it up, his assiduous documentation of direct provision centres, done almost through a lens like Alan Phelan. It's just quite extraordinary. And I feel like this is the question that we have a tendency to revisit our past rather than seeing what's intolerable in our present. And there's absolutely no reason, as Bukhasin said, that we couldn't go back to the way the system was before the introduction of this extremely expensive privatized system run by Aramark that seems to do prisons catering and Mary I's catering and so on. He does everything. Run by that. To a system that simply welcomes people, that certainly gives the people who are waiting at the moment for decisions, why not in this year, give them their refugee status, and then go back to a system that treats them decently like fellow human beings, and give them access to welfare just like anybody else.
But we don't revisit our past. You see, I don't think we revisit our past, because our past is in fact a past of direct provision centres and containment centres of that nature, of coffin ships and so on. And there's so little of that in the curriculum. Our curriculum in school and universities is still obsessed with high politics, if you like, the white male Anglo-Saxon and so on. That's what our history is. So I wish we would revisit our past. Whose past?
I can see. Sorry, what can you wait for the right?
Just in light of the way the questions are being asked about how we revisit the past, this is partly a question for Aislinn in particular, but of course, it'd be great to hear from anyone on it, but it's about that question of colonial and post-colonial, and what we might mean when we talk about post-colonial. And the reference that comes to mind is Homi Bhabha's reflections on post at the beginning of The Location of Culture, where he's talking about that not necessarily as a simplistic coming after, but as a way of perhaps kind of scrambling our sense of time, our sense of the present in relation to the past. And I wonder just if you had, because I know it's come up a couple of times already, about what we mean when we say post-colonial as opposed to a colonial predicament.
It's such a tricky one in the Irish context. Do I say it's colonial, post-colonial, partly post-colonial? I think it's already such a contested area. So in that respect, I feel really ambivalent, and I feel like it's something, I don't feel like those categories are appropriate. For me, and I feel that other people have said this much better through the other panel discussion, the previous panel discussion, through as well Catalina's presentation, the kind of work that has been done elsewhere in terms of thinking about decolonisation, decoloniality, and the need to not pretend that we're in a post-racist society or a post-colonial society, but begin to investigate and explore how those legacies continue to provide the ways in which some bodies are valued more than others, some voices are heard, some are particularised, and so on. So I'm really interested in thinking about what would decolonisation mean and beginning to diagnose the way in which those colonial structures have been maintained, albeit under different names. And this is far more extensive than thinking about the ways in which colonial elites inherited institutions, or the Irish situation in the Republic of simply taking on the imperial legacy. I think it is around the greater question that somebody like Phelan would be asking about the question of humanity in the ways in which some lives are valued more than others, and the way in which an appropriate relation to the earth, that is a particular relation coming out of a Eurocentric modernity of empire, that continues in madness our relation to the planet.
If there isn't no urgent hand, well, there's one. So this is the last question, if you don't mind, and we'll allow Luke his closing remarks, which I'm certainly looking forward to.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just really interested in the intersection between the two presentations there, in terms of talking about sort of the actual and physical architecture and a kind of virtual architecture, and particularly in terms of, John, when you were speaking about the Baroque kind of aspirations to the grid layout and pattern of Perry Newtown, and the idea of the invisibility of those who service the serviced. And it's quite interesting that in the mid-1800s that actually the idea of the architectural building designed around that very principle came about, where the servants were invisible to those who they serviced, in sort of passages around the sort of rooms of the masters of the house. And it also kind of was a forerunner of the panopticon, the idea then that there's a certain sort of consciousness that everybody knows their place, although they're not actually seen in their place necessarily. So I just wanted to kind of put out there this kind of idea of possibly a new Baroque architecture outside the grid, where you have the idea of a little bit more visibility of those who service the serviced in terms of our internet and relations and networks through the web, because we're probably existing on those two different kind of architectures at the moment, that physical architecture and that virtual architecture, the tension between the two of them, but also a kind of potential and an opportunity in a way to sort of see maybe how art may work with that kind of virtual architecture and extract from it some ways of describing the real lives of those who service the serviced. I'm sorry, I know that's a really loaded sort of question, but I just wanted to sort of draw a little kind of tangent to the two kind of presentations there. Thank you.
I think that the existence of the phone, the mobile phone, the web, and all of that, those virtual architectures, I think they do allow the inhabitants of the direct centres and so on to transcend and to escape somewhat. My closing comment would simply be that I don't make any distinction at all between the direct provision centres and our ghettoised suburbs of high degrees of deprivation. To me, it's essentially the same issue, and their existence are a result of the same political failures.
Okay. Well, could I then, in one gesture, thank our speakers, thank the speakers from the floor, and welcome to whichever podium he prefers to deliver some closing remarks, Professor Luke Gibbons, who is Professor of Irish Literary and Cultural Studies in the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and of course, as we all know, over the past 30 years or so, one of Ireland's leading post-colonial critics, and therefore as apt a speaker as any to finish this symposium. So perhaps we'll